Welcome and thank you for standing by. For today's conference, all parties will be on listen only. During the question and answer session, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone if you would like to ask a question. You will be prompted to record your name. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly in order to be introduced into today's conference. Today's call is also being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I want to turn today's call over to Kelly Calloway with the Department of Commerce. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. On behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce Trade Information Center, thank you for joining us today for this program on Incoterms. This webinar is one of a series from the Basic Guide to Exporting program that's designed to help companies new to exporting or train staff new to supporting export activities. You'll see the URL on this welcome slide where you can find upcoming programs as well as recorded programs from earlier in the year. As your host, I want to share with you briefly that the Trade Information Center is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, U.S. Commercial Service, and our agency mandate is to help U.S. companies export more. And with the President's National Export Initiative striving to double U.S. exports by 2015, we certainly all have our work cut out for us. We support American firms via a network of offices around the country, some 108, and we staff the commercial sections of embassies and consulates worldwide. The Trade Information Center is a clearinghouse of information related to doing business overseas, and we facilitate export education programs such as this. We support a very rich website on export.gov and a 1-800 phone number, call center, where you can speak directly with an international trade specialist. Here you'll see on this screen both some of the programs that we have already hosted that are archived that you can listen to, as well as upcoming events. We only have a couple left in the series that we invite you to join at your convenience. And I want to also point out our main web portal, export.gov, a great place to start when you're looking for international trade support. The Begin Exporting has links to just a plethora of resources that I'm sure that you would find very helpful. Our agency is one of many that support the export.gov platform and populate it with information related to international trade. So let me go back to the discussion agenda here for this program today on Incoterms. We're very happy to have a featured trade professional, David Bryant, who is in business development with John S. James. And this company is a Georgia-based customs broker, freight forwarder, international logistics service firm that's been around since 1941, and they really know their stuff. And David has been with John S. James for almost 9 years. He currently works as a business development representative and is an important partner to many importers and exporters relying upon their freight forwarder for everyday business. He authors and distributes the J Report, which is a publication that covers important trends and regulations and other topics related to shipping and moving goods around the world. He's an active player in the international trade community and a true partner in a client's informed export compliance and importantly, profitability. What we like is that he strives to deliver a common sense approach to U.S. companies that are finding difficulties in navigating the export maze. And as you'll see on the agenda here, today he'll be covering what Incoterms do and don't do, and then to help one understand how to apply terms, important terms, such as FOB, CIF, XWorks, et cetera. And as you evaluate dividing costs and responsibilities between the buyer and seller, how to use those features, and then apply those terms, both on the sales, logistics, credit, and supply chain side of it. I also want to mention that you'll have ample time to ask questions, both written. If you see at the top of your screen, there's a Q&A feature. You can submit a written question throughout the program, and then we'll have an operator-facilitated Q&A session after his remarks. So just a couple of quick housekeeping details. If at any time you experience technical difficulties, please press *0 for operator assistance. And then know that later this week we will email all registrants the PowerPoint presentation and a recording of today's program. So with that, I'm going to bring up David's presentation, and ask him to jump in. David?
Thank you very much, Kelly. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. First and foremost, I want to thank the U.S. Department of Commerce and Trade Information Center for providing this arena for all of us to participate in. I can tell you that education and information are probably the most valuable tools that you can use as an exporter or as a participant in international trade. I'm sure that we have a wide variety of expertise here. Many of you may be experienced exporters. Some of you may be beginning or novice exporters. I want to try and cover the gamut here and make this applicable to everyone participating. Now, know that Incoterms could last all day long. We don't have that amount of time, so we will try and move along as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if you have any questions, please feel free. I will answer them to the best of my ability. And without further ado, I think we can begin. Now, something else to consider here. Before we get into the guts of Incoterms, it should be mentioned that export compliance is very, very important. Now, on the Bureau of Industry and Security website, there were press releases, 3 of them in this month alone, that cited violations that resulted in monetary penalties and I think even jail time for some exporters. Now, I don't want to scare you away. The benefits of exporting far outweigh the risks, but you have to temper your exports with profitability and compliance. You should be able to answer every one of these questions on every single export transaction that you have. Most penalties and most issues with noncompliance are a direct result from not being able to answer one or all of these questions. So, let's get into Incoterms. Now, Incoterms. What are they? What do they do? Incoterms, they are not law. What they are is they are guidelines. They are framework. They're recognized around the world by every country that imports and exports, which is pretty much everybody. They're used in international and domestic contracts for the sale of goods. Now, when we say domestic, it's not so much the United States that we're talking about here. A lot of EU members that at one time, before they were EU members, shipments to and from one another were considered international sales. A lot of it is more domestic now, but Incoterms are still used very commonly. Now, let's start out with an example. Let's say you as an exporter, you have shipments that go to Japan, England, and Australia. And let's say the Incoterms never existed. Now, you have 3 containers that you're sending to each country. You have a purchase agreement that's set up with your foreign customers in these destinations. And let's say you get an email from your Japanese customer that your containers are on customs hold in Japan. There are charges that have to be paid to customs, and the containers have gone into storage. They want you to pay. Should you be responsible for the customs examination fees and the storage? Well, without Incoterms, you can't really determine that. Let's say that you have those same 3 containers going to England, and they are also placed on customs hold. Now, your English customer, they say, well, this happens from time to time. We're just going to pay it, and it's going to go through, and you're none the wiser. Who was right? Well, if you knew your Incoterms that were applicable to that particular transaction, then there would be a dividing line for the passage of risks and costs associated with that. Let's say that you have those 3 containers that are going to Australia. One of them makes it there. What happened to the other 2? Did they get left on the dock in the U.S.? Did they get lost in the ocean? Or were they picked up by the wrong importer in Australia? Without Incoterms, there's no provision in the purchase agreement. What law applies? Is it a U.S. law that applies a remedy for this situation, or is it Australian law? Incoterms address these types of issues that happen in international shipping. Before Incoterms, there was no internationally recognized standard. Now that there is, all participating countries that have imports and exports, they recognized Incoterms as a way of doing business, and it was modeled after the generalized business practices between buyers and sellers around the world. So that's what Incoterms do. What they don't do anything about transfer of title, only transfer of risk or passage of risk. If you were to go and buy a brand new BMW today, and you were making payments on it for the next few years, that car isn't yours until you make that last payment and you pay the bank. That's when transfer of title occurs, and there are laws that govern transfer of title in transactions. Incoterms aren't law. They don't do that, but they do transfer risk. Now, payment terms. Payment terms don't have anything to do with Incoterms. Now, if you wanted to extend credit as an exporter, let's say you wanted to extend net 30 days or net 60 days, or you wanted cash up front, that is a business decision that is entirely up to you, and Incoterms exist outside of that. Freight forwarder perspective. This can be particularly important. Before you enter into any transaction, before any shipments take place, you have to have an understanding of Incoterms, what they are, how they apply, so you can use this framework to form your purchase agreements or your contracts. Now, as a freight forwarder, if you came to me and you said, you know, David, I want to ship a container to India. I want to ship it to Nava Shiva. Well, the first thing that I would ask you is, what are your Incoterms? If you are going to ship FOB, Port of Charleston, I'm not going to quote you on the ocean freight all the way to India unless you ask me to. If you ask me for CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, to Nava Shiva, then I know that I am supposed to quote you everything associated with getting it from your door all the way to the port of Nava Shiva with insurance included. So Incoterms tell freight forwarders and customs brokers who's responsible for each portion of the cost. Incoterms are used by foreign freight forwarders and customs brokers as well. A lot of times at destination, Incoterms are used to determine different taxes that are payable. For instance, there might be a particular tax or fee that's payable to a foreign port authority or a foreign customs authority based on the CIF value of the cargo. Also, when it comes to the customs entry, on the other side, there are certain deductions and additions that are added to the invoice value that help determine duty calculation. Now, here is where this can be very helpful for you from a sales standpoint. Let's say you wanted to expand into a new market, let's say Brazil, and you know for a fact that you might have competitors in the U.S., in India, in China, Italy, wherever. Now, you can't assume that you know more or less than any of your competitors, but what you can do is say, well, I know for a fact that I can get good ocean rates or good air freight rates down to Brazil, so I might try and pursue a CIF or a CPT strategy to try and get the goods down there and make money off the transportation. But what you have to know, too, is what types of value-added taxes or other items that are payable at destination. The reason why, even though you might not be paying for that particular portion of the transaction, knowing that your customer has to pay them may make you rethink your selling price on your product. You might have to adjust your margin upward or downward depending on this. If you were shipping to Canada, for instance, general sales tax of 5% would apply on the value of the goods. If you're shipping to Mexico, another NAFTA country, which there may not be duties applicable, but there is a value-added tax of 16% on your goods. So know your destination country. This can be exponentially helpful for you from a sales standpoint. Okay, Incoterms and Nincoterms. What are Nincoterms? Well, I actually learned this myself about, I'd say, a year ago. I was talking to one of my agents in Mexico about some potential truck shipments that we were going to route there. And he says, David, please make sure that they don't use North American Incoterms, Incoterms. Make sure they use a valid Incoterm. So he said this to me because there are certain terms that are unique to specific modes of transport. And the best example I can think of is FOB factory. There is no such thing as FOB factory when it comes to Incoterms and shipping. Now, the FOB factory may sound familiar to a lot of you, and for any of you that have an accounting background, it may be very familiar. Under generally accepted accounting principles, you have what's called FOB shipping point and FOB destination point. All this does is it tells the accounting department where they are going to place this particular entry in the ledger. Is it going to be a liability? Is it going to be a receivable? Is it going to go into owner's equity? It has nothing to do with Incoterms, and it doesn't translate directly into Incoterms. So, no such thing as FOB factory. Remember that. I think pictures tell a better story, and from the chart you see here, I want you to look on the right-hand side of this chart. This is where you will find the Incoterms. I'm highlighting those right now. These are individual Incoterms. Now, I want you, exporters, I want you to think of yourselves as the yellow team, and I want you to think of your customers as the blue team. Now, look at where the yellow changes to blue. I want you to think of this as passing a baton in a relay race. Wherever the color changes to blue is where the passage of risk and sometimes the passage of cost occurs between buyer and seller. So let's say my first example. You have a customer in Germany, and he says, well, let's say you're located in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and your customer in Germany says, you know what, I'll buy from you. I'll do this on an X works basis. So that means, great. As the exporter, you are going to be responsible for this portion only. And you would be selling on an X works, Cherry Hill, New Jersey door type of Incoterm. You should always attach the individual Incoterm to a named place, and that's very helpful. So this means that you are going to have your goods ready on your dock, and this exporter, they are going to assume transfer of risk from your dock all the way to delivery of the cargo terminal, going through U.S. Customs, going on the ship, all the way to their door in Germany, that whole process. So let's change it up a little bit. You have another customer who is in Germany, and they say, yes, I want to buy your product from you, except I don't want to deal with the U.S. freight forwarding, any of the inland trucking. I don't want to do that, so I'll buy FOB. You deliver it to a port that is most accessible to you, and I'll pay for the ocean freight. So in that instance, let's say that this is an FOB transaction, and you being in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, you think, well, the best port for me is going to be Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I'm going to sell based on FOB Philadelphia terms. So you have this is what we're talking about right here, what I'm highlighting right now. So you have the cargo ready on your dock. You are going to arrange for the inland transport through the trucker. You are going to have it delivered to the terminal. You'll submit paperwork to your freight forwarder to do the customs clearance, and then they will get it on the ship. Now, something that might happen, which is not likely to happen, but for purposes of an example, let's say this container, look at the very top of your screen where I'm highlighting right here. This container is being loaded on the ship right now, and we're still talking about the FOB transaction. So in the port of Philadelphia, this container is being loaded, and all of a sudden it drops and it lands on the port. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right here is where the passage of risk occurs. Unfortunately, that container never made it on the ship. It's on the dock. So that transfer of risk never occurred, and it belongs to you. So you better have marine insurance coverage on this. Let's say, in the same example, same Incoterm, the container is being loaded, it falls off, and it drops on the ship. Well, it made it on board. Transfer of risk occurred because it got on the ship. So now it is the buyer's problem. Now, I'm sure this is just for example purposes. It gets a lot stickier than this, and but that's just to serve the importance of knowing your Incoterms, knowing where the passage of risk occurs. All right. Like I said previously, there are certain Incoterms that are only used with specific modes of transport. The 4 Incoterms that you see listed here are only used for ocean freight, more formally for transportation by sea or inland waterway. So if you have a barge or a river service. Free alongside ship. What that would entail is, let's say if you are shipping a yacht or a boat, and that boat is made available on the water alongside the ship. That's free alongside ship. Another example could be, let's say that you are shipping iron ore down the Mississippi River to make a ship in New Orleans. And you're saying, okay, I'm going to load this in Evansville, Indiana. It's going to ship by river barge, and that river barge is going to be made available free alongside the ship in New Orleans. That's when that would occur. Free on board, FOB. Remember, no such thing as FOB factory. You can only use it for waterway transport. Unless you have got a commercial vessel pulling up to your door and you have a port and loading facilities, don't use that. CFR, cost and freight, and CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. These are used for waterway transport. And a lot of times they're used to get to a destination. Say you wanted to ship cost and freight from your door in Cherry Hill, New Jersey to Antwerp, Belgium. Cost and freight. You would be paying for the goods from your door all the way to the port of Antwerp, Belgium. And passage of risk would occur once it got to the port in Antwerp. CIF. Almost the same thing except insurance. You are going to cut an insurance policy, which I highly recommend. Anytime you ship, you want to have insurance. Now, FOB factory. I want to go back to that for just a moment. Do not use FOB factory. There is another Incoterm that can be used for that. And I'll get into those in just a moment. The following Incoterms here can be used with any mode of transport. A lot of times when people say FOB factory, they mean that it is going X works from the location, or FCA Free Carrier from the location. And I'm going to get into these in more detail in just a bit. In fact, I think some of the most important Incoterms we could talk about today are X works, FCA, and delivery duty paid, and also carriage paid too. Cost and insurance paid too. A lot of times you see that with air freight. If you wanted to send an air freight shipment, let's say to Beijing, China, from Atlanta, Georgia, and you're going to pay for getting the goods to the air cargo terminal in Atlanta. You want to pay for the export clearance. You want to insure it. You're going to pay for the air freight, the fuel, getting it all the way to China, and insuring it. And once it's there, then passage of risk occurs to the buyer. DAT, delivered at terminal. This particular Incoterm is new, as well as DAP right below it, delivered at place. These are new Incoterms for this year. They replaced 2 other Incoterms. A lot of times, delivered at terminal is used when you are shipping, let's say, bulk items. Let's say grain or coal or chemicals that are shipped in tanker vessels. And these ships are going to go to a foreign port and made ready to be offloaded. You are not going to get them offloaded. Delivery at terminal, what's going to happen? The terminal is going to offload this coal or this grain onto elevators and take care of the goods there. Delivered at place. A lot of times this has replaced delivered at frontier, DAF. We see this a lot in shipments to Mexico, where the trucker takes the goods to Laredo, Texas, before they go into Mexico, delivered at place. A lot of times you might see this if it's an ocean form of transport. If you are going to deliver at place, sometimes it might require omnimodal transport. It's going to require the ship to discharge at a port and then maybe hauled to an inland rail depot or transfer to another terminal. Delivery duty paid. I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But first things first, exporter liabilities. Now, let's say some of you that might be using FOB factory, this might be what you're actually doing, Ex-Works. And for a lot of folks that might be new to exporting, I do want to call your attention to this. You might have a prospect in China or elsewhere around the world that says, you know what, we want to buy your product and don't worry about any shipping or anything that takes place. We'll take care of it all. Just have it ready on your dock. That does sound attractive. And a lot of people ship this way and have no problems at all. But exporters should be aware that where you might be saving in cost and time, you might be sacrificing a lot of your control of compliance over the transaction. So if someone is saying, we're going to do an Ex-Works shipment with you, I want you to have this shipment ready on your dock, this is where you are as the exporter. You just have the goods ready. The person overseas, what they are going to do is they are going to pick it up from your dock and take care of everything all the way to their door, even going as far as arranging the U.S. freight forwarder to handle the export formalities. I don't recommend this unless you have a long-established relationship with this company or if they are a subsidiary or a sister company. I really wouldn't recommend this, and I'm going to tell you why. For Ex-Works shipments, they're also known as routed transactions. There is a lot of, I guess, outsourcing that the exporter does on a compliance basis. First of all, do you know if you're exporting an item that's considered dual use? So there are some items that are of interest to the U.S. government, and this goes back to those 4 questions that you have to answer on every shipment. What are you exporting? Perhaps you might be shipping circular knitting machinery to a country overseas. It might take just a small amount of engineering to transfer those machines into items that can be used in missile technology or weapons production. Might be an extreme example, but the U.S. government does have a list of dual-use items, and that is something that can be accessed on the Bureau of Industry and Security website or on export.gov. They can route you to information for dual-use items. Also, do you know to whom you are shipping and the product's end use? These have to do with other questions in the export compliance portion of your transaction. Now, if you have an Ex-Works shipment and you're just getting it ready on your dock, what you know is that you're selling it to someone who's going to take care of everything. But how do you know that product may not end up in Cuba or Iran or Sudan or any place like that? You can't be for sure. Also, when you submit documentation to the freight forwarder, this freight forwarder is working for the person overseas. And I want to mention, you know, I don't know of any U.S. freight forwarders that would knowingly or willingly do anything outside of regulations. You know, we all have we all have a commitment to compliance and service. So we wouldn't do anything wrong. But what if you have someone overseas that unknowingly, asks the freight forwarder? They say, when we use this tariff number that's listed on your paperwork, we are charged a higher rate of duty. I want you to change it to this tariff number instead. So maybe the new person at the freight forwarder doesn't know any better. They change the tariff number. They transmit it to AES, and Customs says, wait a second, this doesn't match up. This isn't right. So that shipment is red flagged. Or what if the data was not transmitted to Customs timely? What if it was late? Even though you are not responsible for hiring the person to handle this export clearance, even though you may have submitted all documents on time, U.S. Customs or the Bureau of Industry and Security, they're not going to go after the person overseas. They will come back to the U.S. exporter. And that is because the U.S. exporter is what is known as the U.S. principal party in interest. I'll get into that in just a moment. But another example I want you to know about when it comes to ex-works transactions is a lot of times, even though you are not essentially the exporter of record, there are the foreign principal party in interest here, your name will be listed as the shipper of record on the bill of lading, more often than not. Now, from time to time, there are instances where vessels may collide, or there might be an explosion or a fire or something where the vessel declares general average. General average is not a fun thing. What happens is the transport of the goods are in danger. So the vessel owner stops the voyage, they seize the cargo, and they say, okay, shipper of record, you have no marine insurance policy on this, so you have to pay this big, hefty cash deposit. And that's no fun. So let's see here.
David, related to documentary requirements, a question has come in for ex-works shipments and whether the seller is responsible for completing the commercial invoice. Is that the case for ex-works or all shipments?
Well, for ex-works, yes, they are, because there are some items that are on the commercial invoice that are unique knowledge of the exporter. So, yes. Now, there are times where a freight forwarder can create a commercial invoice. And for ex-works transactions, the party overseas may ask them to create a commercial invoice. So Incoterms don't necessarily say yes or no on that. So that's kind of a gray area. But more often than not, yes, the exporter will be responsible for completing the commercial invoice, and they should. I hope that answers that question. Exporter liabilities. I'm going to repeat, USPPI, U.S. principal party in interest. You receive monetary benefit from the export. You knowingly created an export. Therefore, you have a vested stake in that. If you are shipping on an ex-works transaction, especially if it's a new transaction or a new customer, be very wary of doing ex-works terms. Where you might not bear any of the cost up front, you bear all the liability. Now, non-compliance issues can really run the gamut. Let's say if the AES, Automated Export System, information is submitted to that late. For every day that's late, that's $1,100 that's going to be assessed on you, even though you had no say-so in the shipment. Some exporters might be subject to fines of $250,000. They might be assessed personal fines, civil and criminal proceedings, even jail time. So you've got to be really, really careful. And
related to this, some of the liabilities and transferring of responsibilities such as completing commercial invoice. A question came in related to the need for power of attorney. Is that the case if exporter wants to have the freight forwarder complete the commercial invoice or other documentation for them?
Yes. On an exports transaction, normally the foreign principal party in interest issues a power of attorney. Now, there are a lot of freight forwarders that say, listen, I know it's an exports transaction, but you are responsible for this stuff. I'm going to be submitting stuff on your behalf. I need an authorization from you to submit your EIN number, your information, to U.S. Customs. And there are some freight forwarders that say, we will need this, even though it's an export transaction. We will need your signature. You're okay to do this. I want to address some of the shortcomings that are involved with ExWorks. If you're uncomfortable with sacrificing the compliance aspect, you can achieve the same results using a different Incoterm. It's called FCA Free Carrier. The only difference between FCA and ExWorks, right here. I hope you can see this. And I'm sorry, I'm not an artist. Export clearance. When you ship under FCA terms, you as the exporter are now responsible for handling the export clearance. This is exponentially beneficial to you. The reason why it offers a little bit more flexibility and it addresses potential areas of non-compliance. This allows you as the exporter, you can control which freight forwarder that you use. So the freight forwarder is now working for you and not the person overseas. It allows you greater visibility to see that the electronic export information was filed timely to AES. You can actually request from your exporter, if you are shipping on FCA term or any other term other than ExWorks, you can say, all right, freight forwarder, I want you to provide me with proof of filing. The freight forwarder, by law, will provide you with that information. This allows you to see, okay, I had this much information on my commercial invoice, and the freight forwarder submitted this data to U.S. Customs on this date at this time, and it matches everything I gave them. So this is great. When you ship under ExWorks terms, you don't have that type of flexibility. You can only request information that you provided to the freight forwarder. They won't be able to tell you anything about the EEI or the transmission. They may tell you you have to contact your person overseas. FCA also offers you a bit more flexibility in the United States. FCA can be used either on your dock. So let's say you have you ship FOB factory, which it shouldn't be FOB factory, but let's say you're shipping ExWorks. You can use FCA, your door, and you can have the person overseas pick up from your door, and you can still have control of the export clearance. Or you can have FCA at a particular terminal in a particular port. So there's a lot more flexibility that you have with this. A good question that came in that I'd like to mention is if the seller prepares the export docs for the ExWorks shipment, can the seller also file AES and report the ITN number on the commercial invoice to ensure it is done on time? Normally, under ExWorks transactions, the freight forwarder is working for the guy overseas, and this is where information on your individual purchase agreement or purchase contract is paramount. You might be shipping under the guise of ExWorks, but since you are providing the freight forwarder the information, if you're paying for the clearance, then you're actually shipping under FCA terms. When you do an ExWorks transaction, can you file AES yourself? Remember, Incoterms are not law, so there's no legislative power that's associated with them. You know, you might be shipping under ExWorks, and you might be paying for a freight forwarder to do your filing for you. I would adjust my Incoterm to use FCA instead of XWorks. There's no hard, fast rule that says you can't do it. In fact, I have had shippers in the past, they say, this is an XWorks transaction, but my customer, they feel more comfortable if I get the rates for them and I vet the freight forwarders for them to use. And that's okay, too. So there's a lot of flexibility that can be achieved in Incoterms. And you would definitely want to lean on that strong relationship that you have with your person overseas. If it's a newer relationship, I might not be doing XWorks to start out. Now I want to talk about the other end of the spectrum, delivery duty paid. Perhaps you have a new customer overseas, and they say, I would love to buy your product, but I just want it delivered to my door. I don't want anything to do with any of the shipping, any of the customs, anything like that. So there you might have a DDP, delivery duty paid transaction. And there are lots of shippers that ship this way. Just had a question about FCA I want to address before I move on. So with FCA terms, the seller will be responsible for the documentation charges. Yes, that is correct. The seller will be responsible for the documentation charges. Now, DDP. Okay, you are going to send a shipment all the way, let's say you want to send it to Marseille in France, and you are going to send it DDP. That is fine. If you're an experienced shipper, you have knowledge of French customs regulations, the commodity, the regulations that are associated with the commodity, the transportation, you speak the language, maybe that might not be so bad for you. But for novice exporters, I wouldn't recommend this right away. Now, the reason why is when you ship under DDP, delivery duty paid terms, do you know for sure if you're in compliance with the foreign customs regulations? There might be a specific regulation governing your commodity that says you need to have this formulary certificate approved by the Ministry of Health in order to make sure this is compliant. Do you know that for sure? I don't know. What if you're shipping a particular item that when you export it, it's shipped under a particular Schedule B number, but when it's imported, due to the general rules of interpretation, the tariff number shifts and the duty goes sky high. You don't know that. If your shipment goes on exam, will you pay for storage charges and for the customs exam? Will you be able to afford a day or two lost due to the time zone difference? So that's something to consider there. Another thing, VAT, value-added tax. That's a gray area. A lot of times, even on DDP shipments, the exporter might not be responsible for VAT tax. But I had one customer who said, all right, I've got to ship these goods to South Korea, and they're telling me that I have to pay the VAT, and it's $3,400. Well, they went ahead and did it. They paid the $3,400. The shipment got over to South Korea. And the thing is value-added tax is something that is reimbursed on the other side when the goods are sold. So the Korean importer got that $3,400 back, but that money didn't come back to the U.S. And the exporter doesn't have claim to that because they do not have a tax ID number in the destination country. So be careful when you ship under DDP terms. Know also, too, as far as value-added tax, different countries have different rates of value-added tax. And sometimes your selling price might have to be adjusted according to the value-added tax in the destination country. If you have one country that assesses a VAT of 16% on the value of your cargo, you might have to trim down your selling price just a little bit, as opposed to a country who has maybe 6% VAT. So that's always helpful for you to know that. And also have explicit terms in your purchase agreement that says if you're going to ship DDP, that you will or you will not be responsible for any value-added tax. Another thing, if you have someone that says, I want it shipped to my door and I don't want to have to do anything, you might have a little bit of legroom that says, you know, I don't have a problem shipping it to your door, but, you know, I'm not an expert in the customs formalities and requirements there. I'd be much more comfortable if you use a preferred customs broker in your country. So an answer to that could be shipping CPT, carriage paid to. What that does is you can arrange to have this delivered to any point in the country. It could be to a rail depot in the country. It could be to the buyer's door, but you're not going to pay for the customs clearance and the duties that are associated with that. It can fulfill the same delivery obligations that you could have on DDP, and it can also decrease your liability for any foreign customs compliance. You don't want to claim that you are expert in any foreign customs authorities' regulations, and when you ship DDP, you are assuming responsibility for that. Also, when you ship on CPT, it allows you to control the mode of shipping with a preferred carrier. Let's say you prefer one steamship line or airline carrier over another. The passage of risk, you're better off with this Incoterm. The passage of risk for CPT terms occurs when the goods are tendered to the main transportation carrier. By main transportation carrier, that is normally the steamship line or the airline, whoever's responsible for the main carriage of that shipment. And again, CPT also offers you the flexibility within the destination country. It can be used anywhere. You can just do it up to the airport or to the port, or let's say you have an inland container depot. A lot of times shipping to Costa Rica, I use that. You know, the surface port is Puerto Limón, Costa Rica, but a lot of times freight goes into San Jose, an inland destination point. So I know that I've seen a lot of freight go CPT to San Jose, Costa Rica. Here are some general tips for you guys as exporters. Now, Incoterms, they can't encompass every potential situation. Let's face it, you can have all your I's dotted, all your T's crossed, and in logistics, sometimes there are customs exams, sometimes things happen that are just out of everyone's control. The best thing that you can do to arm yourself, you should be cognizant of the current events and the destination countries you ship to or want to ship to. You should know of any political or economic incidents that may have an effect on your ability to sell at destination. Perhaps there are a lot of port strikes in that particular destination country. Perhaps there may be requirements for your shipment to deliver with armed guards. At one time, shipping to inland destinations in the country of Colombia, South America, required armed guards to transport the goods. And sometimes it had nothing to do with the stuff that was inside. It was people wanted the container so they could build a house. Let Incoterms lay the groundwork for you to form your purchase agreement and use explicit language in your Incoterms. You want to have things like a remedy. If you are shipping to someone overseas, under what laws are you forming the purchase agreement? What remedies are available in forms of arbitration? Does it have to be an individual arbitration panel that's independent of either country? Things like that. Had a good question. Is DDU no longer an Incoterm? DDU is under Incoterms 2000. That was the last revision of Incoterms. If on your commercial invoice, if you state that you're using Incoterms 2000, you can use DDU, delivery duty unpaid. So you can use that as long as you explicitly mention that. But instead of DDU, I would use most likely either CPT or DAP, delivery at place. So, thank you, everybody. I hope that I covered this well enough. I hope that I maybe have answered some of the questions that you have. This is my information if you need to get a hold of me. But I also want you to remember, in many of the cities that you have locally and even around the world, you have a U.S. Commercial Service office. that can help provide access to information on things like value-added tax for a particular country. You have the Trade Information Center as a 1-800 number. You know, these are your tax dollars at work, and they work very hard for you. I know that personally, some of the experiences I've had with U.S. Commercial Service and the Trade Information Center, these are skilled, knowledgeable people. They're wonderful, and they are in business to help you as an exporter. So use that resource and use a freight forwarder, your local freight forwarder, as that. So I'd like to open the floor up to any questions. This concludes my portion of the presentation. So if there's anything that that you guys have, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for the plug, of course, to encourage all the participants to use their federal resources available to them. The Trade Information Center and their local U.S. Commercial Service Office. Export.gov is the main web portal where you can find that contact information. And to return the favor, not only for the great resources of John S. James and David, but consider your freight forwarder your partner, and really work with them as you're receiving the purchase order, you're working on your sales quote, and what will be the best terms to extend, and the language and the things to ask. Even issues we didn't get into, considerations as it relates to packaging and ports to use and other issues. So they're a wonderful partner in trade. There's been quite a few questions that have come in. We'll work to answer as many of those as we can in the next 8 minutes or so. I also want to ask the operator now to explain to our participants how you can verbally ask your question.
Thank you. And at this time, if you would like to ask an audio question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone, and please record your name in order to be introduced into the conference. Thank you.
And while we're waiting for that, just to pick off one of the questions that have come in recently, what's the difference, David, between transfer of risk and transfer of title?
Transfer of risk and transfer of title. Transfer of title is actually who owns the goods. Transfer of risk means you may not necessarily own the goods yet, but the transfer of risk occurs if there is a loss or if there's damage to the cargo. Incoterms address transfer of risk in particular, and a lot of times where you might, like in a DDP, delivery duty paid instance, the transfer of cost and transfer of risk is much different. When the cargo gets to the foreign terminal at destination, when it's unloaded, the transfer of risk to the physical cargo transfers to the buyer, but the transfer of cost still applies to the seller. Transfer of title doesn't occur until money changes hands. Until you are paid for that, transfer of title does not occur in most instances.
Thank you. Are there any questions that have come in, Denise?
I do have 2 questions. The first is from Brian Deard. Your line is open.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I want to say this is very impactful. I am a new startup on the international import and export. To be honest, some of the information I heard in the beginning was very scary about liability, but I've been working with the SCORE organization here in Chicago. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind. It's 2 parts, and I'll call David on his business phone to ask him some other questions at another time. One, what organizations, for a person who's new to the industry and is a startup, there's so many organizations to join, would you recommend or can you recommend as far as trade organizations? One, for instance, network, or just to have information that's about the industry and the latest techniques or strategies or compliance issues?
Okay. The first thing I can say, hands down, bar none, you want to contact your U.S. Commercial Service Office right there in Chicago. Chances are they may have received similar calls or questions from exporters or producers of similar products. A lot of times there might be associations. Let's say if you ship bakery machinery, there is a bakery machinery association somewhere in America and you might be able to rely on expertise of some of those members. But as far as trade and compliance information, get with your U.S. Export Office. A lot of the information they can offer you is free of charge. Some things do cost money, but you'd be astounded at the amount of resources available to you just from that.
Great.
Most states, not only at the federal but the state level, will have networking receptions, international trade events, and so it's a matter of getting on their distribution list. So not only on the federal side to find out about local events and activities and agencies, but the state side, contact the International Trade Division of your local state.
Okay. Thank you. I gave you the other question, right? I think it is. Well, I'll let somebody else go first.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Next question?
And that comes from Louis, and I did not catch the last name. If you could please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Louis Nizet. I want to thank Mr. Bryan for his fantastic presentation. They're very interesting. He showed a graph with a picture of from the seller to the buyer and all the different positions where the goods are transiting on the trip. And below that there are some yellow and blue lines. Now, looking at the lines, most of them in the middle seems to transfer right at the same point there, which I guess is difficult on the paper to show that it can be moved to different places. But I have a question because I want to make sure that if you use, for say, an FAC, FOB, CFR term also, it can be at another destination than just the point where you load the ship at the departure point.
Okay. Yes. Now there are some terms. They look exactly the same, like the yellow meets the blue at the very same point in there, but the different Incoterms just imply that there are different things that are included. For instance, FOB. What that is that for FOB, the transfer of risk occurs once the goods are on the ship. Also, the exporter is paying for those goods to get on the ship. Now, when you have something that is CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, CIF, yes, the transfer of risk occurs when that is loaded on the ship, but you might be able to have a CIF to a destination port if you have CIF to Auckland, New Zealand. You can't do FOB to Auckland, New Zealand. The FOB is on an export point, like FOB Charleston.
Because your graph seems to show that CIF is at the port of loading, and it's usually at the port of destination.
And that is correct. The CIF, when you're using the CIF terms, normally CIF and then the named place is at a destination point. But for transfer of risk purposes, once that cargo is tendered to the main carrier, either the airline or the steamship line, it talks about transfer of risk, so not necessarily transfer of cost. So that transfer of risk changes from buyer to seller once that cargo is tendered on the main vessel or main.
Okay, so all those terms where the line crosses at the loading zone there, the risk is always changing there at the level of the destination for the freight?
Correct.
Okay, great.
Yes.
That's something I missed. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's not a problem. Happy to help.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
There are no other questions from the phone line.
Okay, I want to mention that one of the participants has suggested to that caller about networking and groups to plug into the International Compliance Professionals Association as a good one, ICPAINC. Thank you for that. David, I don't know, just have another minute or two if there was any particular questions that have popped in that you want to touch on.
Yes, I'm going to try and go through these as quickly as possible. FCA terms, the seller will be responsible for the documentation charges. Short answer is yes. Another question here, if you use DDP, can you send an invoice to the end customer buyer the DDP charges? Normally, no, you cannot, but if you have specific verbiage in your purchase contract that says, look, we'll ship under the guise of DDP terms, but you have to reimburse us, that's different. A lot of the times when you ship under DDP terms, all of those costs are rolled into the invoice amount, so they end up paying it anyway. if customer declines insurance and the ship sinks, who pays for the loss? The selling term was CPT. If you have a selling term of CPT, carriage paid to, then there is no specific area in that particular Incoterm that addresses insurance. Therefore, you have to rely on your purchase agreement, and your purchase agreement should have explicit language that says who is responsible for the marine insurance. And if there was a loss or cargo damage, then what results from that if there was no insurance offered. I say to all exporters, have marine cargo insurance, because even if it's lost, even if it's not your fault, can you afford another 30 days or however much time it takes to manufacture and ship? What's the difference between DDU and CPT? Delivery duty unpaid and CPT, carriage paid to. There's not a lot of difference. DDU, if you're using that term, it implies that the seller must insure the shipment. CPT doesn't necessarily address the insurance issue. Do we still have a little bit of time?
Sure, 2 more, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay. If we have a shipment from our warehouse in New Jersey to the forwarder's warehouse in California, we will pay freight forwarders designated warehouse. We don't want to be responsible for unloading export costs. From New Jersey to California, Canada. I might have to answer this one off the line. It looks a little bit more detailed, but I will do that. If we ship FCA, are we required to provide any import documentation to the destination country? Import documentation. You should provide a commercial invoice, packing list, bill of lading. You should provide that to your person overseas so they can accommodate for customs clearance. But import-specific documents, they're responsible for any certificates or anything that's unique to the customs clearance over there.
David, thank you so much. I know that more could continue to pop in. There's a lot of nuances to these terms and their application. I've left the slide up there that has David's direct contact information, but I want all participants to know that later this week you'll be receiving not only a copy of the slide deck, but also a very useful reference chart where David has outlined who's responsible, the buyer, the seller, and under the different Incoterms. So look for that. That'll be a great one to keep on file. You'll also receive a recording, a link to a recording of today's program, which you can reference at any point in the future. And last but not least, please do check back and at our export.gov site. We will have other basic guide to exporting webinars coming up, and those may be useful for you or some of your colleagues in your organization. On behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce, U.S. Commercial Service, and of course the Trade Information Center, I want to thank you for joining us today and wish you much success in your export activities. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you for participating in today's conference. We appreciate your attendance, and you may disconnect at this time. Thank you.